If you've been following along with Brickonomics, most of what we've talked about is pretty structured. Systems, financials, lessons that we've learned over time, things that you can actually take and apply to your business. But the reality is that running a construction company doesn't always feel that clean. It's not always a framework. It's not always a clear system. Sometimes it's just pressure. Sometimes it's uncertainty. Sometimes it's trying to make the best decisions you can when you don't really have all of the information. And every once in a while, something happens that tests everything all at once. So this is what this is. This is the first episode of something I'm calling Brickonomics Unplugged. And the idea behind this is simple. This is where we're going to talk about what it actually looks like to run a construction business in real time. Not after everything is cleaned up and turned into a lesson, but while things are still happening, while decisions are being made, while things still feel a little uncertain. Because the truth is, you don't really learn much about your business when everything's going right. You learn when something changes, when schedules stop working, when communication gets messy, when you're forced to make decisions that actually matter. And for us, this past year, that moment came when a hurricane hit us. It disrupted everything. Our jobs stopped, our schedules got thrown off. Access to our job sites became an issue. Communication was significantly harder. And for a period of time, it felt like we were operating without a clear playbook. And when you're in that kind of situation, you find out really quickly what's real in your business. Not what looks good on paper, not what looks good when things are smooth, but what actually holds up when there's pressure. And I want to say this up front. We're going to talk pretty openly about what this looked like for us as a business. Not necessarily because things went wrong, but because this is how you actually improve. Every business goes through moments like this. The difference is whether you learn from them and build something stronger on the other side. And that's really the goal of this conversation, because I spent a lot of my time thinking about the business from a financial and strategic standpoint, cash flow, structure, long-term decisions. But the day-to-day reality of a business, the jobs, the crews, the schedules, that all runs through your operations, and that's where things either work or they don't. So today I've got with me Kevin Griffin. He's our Vice President of Operations. Kevin's responsible for making sure that the machine actually runs. He's overseeing our production team, our project managers, our supervisors, our crews, everything from how jobs are staffed to how schedules are built to how problems get handled on a daily basis. And during this time, he was right in the middle of it, dealing with jobs that were starting and stopping, working through situations with payments, especially insurance ones, managing new team members that we brought on quickly to support demand, and doing that all while the normal structure of the business was being disrupted. So what I want to do today is just talk through that and talk about what it looked like from an operations standpoint, what broke, what decisions had to be made, and where we felt the pressure. And then on the back end, what we've changed because of it. So how's it going, Kevin?
Good. Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So why don't we start with what the week kind of leading up to the hurricane looked like on your side?
Yeah. So, we had our typical projects, what that looked like for us. We typically keep anywhere from 20 to 30 projects going at one time. The majority of those being remodels, additions, renovations, bathrooms, kitchens, stuff like that. A couple of new home constructions going at the time as well. So, we were pretty busy, and things were seemingly moving at a pretty good pace. No, real major issues. Our personnel wise, organizationally, we were starting to talk about, what growth looked like for us in the next year. So there were those conversations that were already happening. And, but for the most part, nothing really out of the ordinary. We're just kind of going through our typical workflow and, trying to get these projects that we had on our slate, moving forward. So
yeah, so it was, we kind of had an idea that weather was coming. The National Weather Service was telling us that it was going to hit another area, mainly Greenville, I think, whenever we first started looking at it. So what were you guys doing to kind of prep the jobs for that weather coming in?
Yeah, so really, I mean, we just kind of had to take a look at our specific projects and kind of the logistics surrounding those. What projects seemed like they were most at risk. If we had any projects that had exposed walls or roofs or what have you, making sure that we took measures to make sure those jobs were safe, and take as many measures as we could to, warn our clients about any potential hazards that might, come from high winds or heavy rains. And so, some of the jobs we filled sandbags, and we tried to mitigate some potential water issues that we thought we might have. And we did the same for our office, right? So we knew that we were in a flood zone, and our basement had taken on water before. So we took some measures to try and mitigate that as best we could. And so really it's just a lot of communication with our clients, with our tradespeople, and our people, right? So also allowing our people the opportunity to get their sort of homes and properties in order to take on some potential severe weather. Yeah.
So when did it kind of, because there was kind of a switch, right? So the night before the hurricane actually happened, or the day before the hurricane actually happened, we had some pretty treacherous downfalls that night before, which I thought, and I think everybody did, that maybe that was just a band of the hurricane that we were going to get, and that was kind of going to be the worst of it. When did it go from this is just going to be some bad weather to this is probably going to affect everything that we do?
Yeah, so in typical Western North Carolina fashion, the weather reports are not always extremely reliable, but for the most part, we knew that something severe was coming, and so we thought, hopefully that the rain, the heavy rain that we sustained, I think it was that Friday, was maybe the most of it, and that we'd kind of, escaped, if you will, but and then we were wrong. So I would say, we kept in communication, our folks at the office kind of kept in communication about making sure everybody was good and had everything they needed. But as the storm progressed, and I think you had made it back to the office to see, kind of check on the office and see what we were dealing with, and had noticed quite a bit of water up against the back of the building. So really, like, once we had, figured out what resources we had available, who was available to come kind of help defend the building, if you will. So, all kind of met up at the office and took shifts, and I think you and a couple other people had kind of spent the most of the time overnight and making sure that, or I guess kind of waiting until ultimately it kind of broke through, and there was really nothing else we could do. But personally, that next day, we got pretty lucky and didn't have any significant damage in our neighborhood or on our road. So we were able to get out and kind of collect ourselves and start assessing the damage and kind of what the next steps look like for us personally. And then once we were okay, it was all right. How do we kind of start picking up the pieces and figuring out what we could do next to, one, go check out the office and figure out who needs help and kind of what was next for us.
Yeah, I think on my side, I was out the night before. I was out in downtown, and that the first torrential downpour happened, and so I rushed back to the office, and we had already put in some preparations. We had taped up the building, put up sandbags, things like that. But the water got so high that it was starting to come in through the walls already. And so I'm here with a squeegee, just like pushing water into our sump pump for a couple of hours. And once we got past that, I mean, it stopped raining. I was like, oh, well, that was not so bad. Yeah. Like, if this is all that it's going to be, I mean, yeah, it's worse than what we've gotten before, but it was manageable. So I kind of figured out a way to do that. And then that night we're all still kind of thinking that there's going to be some more weather, but that was probably the worst of it. And by the time I went to bed, which was like 2 or 3 in the morning, because we were waiting up just to see if it was going to get severe again, nothing had really gone on. And then I woke up at like 5 or 6 in the morning and drove back over to the office because it had started to rain, and then proceeded to spend the next 4 or 5 hours over here trying to keep water that was accumulating on the side of the building from coming back in, rather unsuccessfully, because eventually it got up to the windows, broke out the windows, and then you got hundreds of gallons of water coming in, and there's not not really much you can do once you got that going on. So yeah, and that's kind of like the moment that I realized that this wasn't really going to be a quick disruption. This was probably going to be something that was going to affect us for some time. Obviously, we lost power. There was a lot of issue getting around town just because there was no power anywhere. We had lost municipal services for water and sewer. All the electrical lines were down across everywhere around here. So now that the office is down and access is limited and things aren't really running normally, once we actually are able to get back into the office, what actually broke first from kind of an operations standpoint?
Well, really, the biggest challenges we had initially were communication, logistics. That first week or 2 weeks was really, one, figuring out what resources we had available to us, right? You mentioned not having cell service. That was hard to kind of get in touch with our people and make sure they were okay. And fortunately, all of our people and their direct families and homes were good. Nobody sustained any major damage or loss, and that was great. But then slowly we kind of started accumulating at the office throughout the week, trying to clean up our own space and figuring out, okay, how are we going to get to these projects to check and see what sort of damage our projects sustained. And that was kind of the initial mindset was like, all right, we have all of these projects that we're responsible for. Let's find a way to go check on these and see where we stand with those. And that was a challenge in and of itself because, like you mentioned, we've got trees and power lines down across roads, so many road closures. So we started accumulating sort of a list of what projects we could and couldn't get to. There were obviously calls coming in from either folks we did know or were currently working with, or folks wondering if we could come, get a tree off of their roof, or were we operational. And so kind of managing the projects that we already had on our slate with incoming calls for us, throughout the community for, if we were available to help them, which, it was still a little unclear at that point because we didn't really know what resources we had available to us. So that first week, the first couple of weeks were really spent kind of making a plan for our people and our projects, and also starting to figure out how or what ways we could also kind of help other potential people that needed certain things on their houses or emergency type situations. So that was a chaotic first couple of weeks, just kind of getting settled back in once we were, back in the office and somewhat operational.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting situation because you've got jobs that are currently underway, and some of those jobs now have trees on top of them. So it's not like you can just go back to whatever it was that you were doing. You kind of have to make a new plan even for jobs that are already in progress. And the other thing that happened is some of these clients that we work with they're not in town, right? So this is like a second home for them, or they're remodeling a space that they're going to be moving into later. And the hurricane was so devastating that they call us and they're like, hey, don't worry about us. Push forward with your other projects, help get your area back together. And so the logistically and schedule wise, it was very difficult to understand which projects were going to move forward, if any of the projects were going to move forward. And then of course we made sure to reach out to all of our past clients, make sure that they didn't have any issues that they would need help with. And if they did, then we would try to get them on the schedule so that we could help them out. So, but I think one of the big issues, another one of the big issues was inspections, right? The permitting department basically shut down for 5 weeks, something like that.
Yeah.
And so how are you supposed to get anything inspected anyway? And so it was kind of like just this madhouse of like everybody just does whatever it is that they want, and no inspections to be had because there's no permit authority really around to help make those things happen or to push through other designs or anything like that. So as far as like jobs starting and stopping, did they just all immediately stop, or how did you know which ones were going to fully stop or slow down?
Yeah, so there was a period of time. I mean, I would say most jobs stopped for at least 4 weeks while we kind of gathered ourselves. We took care of some sort of emergency type situations on existing projects or past clients, like you mentioned. And then once we had been able to reach out and to some of our trade partners, some of our material suppliers, and sort of found, a way forward, or what sort of ways forward we had. I mean, it was definitely not what our typical processes looked like prior to the storm, but there was a way forward to at least for us to get to some of our projects. A lot of them certainly were stopped for longer than 4 to 5 weeks because there just wasn't access to them, or like you had mentioned, our clients that were understanding of the situation we were in, and they said, hey, kind of put us on the back burner while you guys figure this out. We're not in a hurry. We'll be patient, which was very, nice of them to be that understanding, but obviously we want to do everything we could. So
it's kind of like triaging.
Yeah, it really was. So obviously, existing projects that we had, there were multiple projects that did get some tree damage to the roofs, and you kind of bring in the insurance claim to this whole situation, that we kind of have to stop and assess, okay, this was our scope of project prior to the storm, and now we have a tree that has, caused a significant amount of damage to our project. Whether or not that has affected our work area or not, right, it still changes the scope of the project. So entering that into play and dealing with the insurance companies and while trying to help guide some of these some of our clients through the insurance claims process was another layer of difficulty that certainly created a lot of delays and learning for us, because that's not typically what we deal with. So it was a slow process in getting started back, logistically, with constraints on who we had access to trade-wise. Obviously there were delays in material and...
Yeah, I think you mentioned trades. That's something we haven't really hit on yet, but that was a big deal, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, we had some folks that a contractor is really worth the book of people that he knows to call or to call. And we had people that completely lost their entire business.
Right. And everyone's personal situation was different, right? Whether or not they lost equipment or their personal homes or their, personal vehicles in the storm, it all came into play and had an effect on what their availability was to us. And so, much like our projects and our employees, reaching out to them and seeing, one, hey, are you guys okay? And is there anything that we can do to sort of facilitate you guys getting back to work. And in some cases, they did lose everything, and they weren't able to really move forward. They either had to relocate to another area, or the folks that they had working for them had suffered, a significant enough loss to where they were going to move, to another area, and they just didn't have the resources to keep their business open. So that was difficult as well, but and certainly something we had to work through. But eventually, once we had figured out sort of what all we had at our disposal, we then kind of tried to step forward as best we could in getting some of these projects back moving. It helped that we had internal crews that could immediately go and sort of start working on projects that we did have accessible, work sites for, and we had the resources we needed to move those forward. So that was good. But yeah, it was just a lot of variables, a lot of, sort of, like you said, with the permitting office, they weren't reachable, right? They didn't have an office to operate out of. And so that whole process changed for a long period of time. And so just dealing with that variable was a learning experience as well. So.
Yeah, so essentially we see a lot of operational change immediately. We see a lot of variance in logistics and things that we can do around that. But another piece of this that we haven't really talked about yet is customers and new customers, right? Because we're right in the middle of this, or right post-storm, and our area has been absolutely destroyed. I mean, there are thousands of homes that have been hit with trees now, and we're practically set up to help with the recovery because we are in a remodeling company. So, I mean, we have the staff to be able to help with these types of projects. And, we kind of had to make the decision, is this something that we're going to get into, that we're going to help with? And then you kind of have to make all of the decisions after that in accordance to that decision, right? So now we've had this exploded market of work. It is restoration work, which is something that we haven't done in the past. But I know for me, from being from this area, I felt an obligation to try to help get the area back into shape as quickly as possible. And being as tooled as we were to be able to do this, that it felt like the right thing to take on restorations. What did you see? I mean, from a sales and operations standpoint, what did you see that changed in our business to accommodate that new type of business?
Yeah, and I think it was important that it was unanimous, right, across the board. We all felt the need to help out in whatever way we could, and we were set up to take on this type of project in whatever way we could. So it was nice to have everyone on the same page there. But that definitely, in theory, right, it should be pretty simple, right? We're just kind of plugging in this project for this project, not really taking into account what other variables come into play with restoration projects. So something that really, really taxed our sales department, our project consultants, is, and we touched on it a little bit before, but introducing the insurance side of it with that sales process. So obviously we're getting flooded with phone calls, from minor damage to our entire house is gone, right? They've deemed it uninhabitable, and we need to know, what our options are, right? Can you walk us through this process? We need help. And so our sales team had to learn pretty quickly what that process looked like, which
it's a bit of a learning curve.
Yeah. So and kudos to them. They did. They had a lot of very long conversations with insurance adjusters and a lot of site visits with the adjusters, learning how they operated and what they were looking for, really just how to communicate with them, because it's a totally different software that they use for their estimates, understanding how that process looked for how we currently operate, right, on the sales side. So that was a tough process to understand at first, and even throughout, until the last restoration we did, right? I don't think we had one sales process that was just cut and dry, really smooth, right? There was always it was almost always a 3 or 4 back and forths with the insurance company, or you would make significant progress for the client in their claim, and then a new adjuster would come in, and you're essentially having to start that process over, which was very taxing. It caused a lot of delays on clients being able to finalize those claims and get their projects moving. But on the operations side, it seemingly should follow a very similar path as our typical like complex remodels, right? But there was a lot of mitigation that had to be done on the front end, whether it be mold remediation or asbestos remediation with these new homes that, these weren't selective projects for these clients, right? And so damage being done to a 100-year-old home where, they haven't had any work done in a long time, and now you're introducing all of the,
Yeah, they don't change the rules about having
Right.
to abate things just because your house was hit by a terrific or a horrific hurricane.
Right. So there was a lot of logistical things like that. As far as sequencing, how our projects typically move, it didn't really change that much. But the operational thing that I would say was the hardest to, I guess the biggest hurdle we had was payment on jobs. Right. And that kind of falls in line with the insurance conversation. I don't know if you want to touch on that a little bit.
Yeah, I think that one thing that maybe we didn't recognize immediately is that restoration projects are not our core business, and and one of the reasons why is because it's a very different client, right? It's not that the clients aren't grateful for the work, but in our regular projects, they ask us to do something to their house, so they're prepared for what construction is going to do to their lives and their normal routines. When restoration work is going on, they were not prepared. They didn't ask for this, and so they're not prepared both from mentally standpoint, and they're also not prepared financially in a lot of instances as well. And so that was a big deal, right? Like we had to figure out how to navigate payment on jobs when payment is not coming from your client, it's coming from a third party. So yeah, I mean, that was a big challenge and something that we definitely want to talk about. So what were you seeing with insurance payments and client payments once we actually got several of these jobs underway?
Well, ultimately, we saw a lack of payment from the insurance company, and which caused a lot of job stops and delays on projects. So I think one of the things that either the insurance companies didn't understand or didn't want to understand was how we utilized the customer deposit, right? And when they paid out the deposit to the client, right, and they pay us, they're assuming that money goes towards job costs.
Right.
And so we would get to our first draw and invoice the client. The client would go to the insurance and say, hey, I need money for this draw. And they would say, well, we've already billed you this initial draw. We need to see progress to this point before we'll release more money, right? And they were not taking into account that this money was being used for a deposit and not for job costs. And so that was a big hurdle for us to clarify or try to clarify with the client and the insurance companies was what our structure was, right? What our contract with the client was, so that they understood where that money was going to. And ultimately, that responsibility lies on the client. And there was obviously difficulty there because, we weren't going through our normal process where they didn't go through our normal sales process, right? Where these things are typical, right? It was the process involving the insurance company or a third party that wasn't familiar with how we billed or how we invoiced, and created a lot of confusion, a lot of frustration on the client side, because it's not that they didn't want to pay us for the work that we had completed. They didn't have the money unless the insurance paid us.
Right.
So
the clients wanted to pay us. But
so they were just kind of stuck in the middle. And unfortunately for us, with 40 plus restoration projects going on at once, our position was, hey, we can't finance your project. We can't be the bank here for all of these projects. We can't keep working on your job until we get payment. And so that's what caused a lot of the delays, a lot of the job stops on these projects, and really what kind of made it difficult as far as sequencing jobs and stopping and picking up and starting again. It was a little clunky, a lot clunky, and chaotic at times.
So were projects continuing even though payments weren't coming in?
Yeah, at first, and I say at first, but for a while, because we felt we had empathy for these people who had just gone through this, catastrophic event and, lost their home or had significant damage to their home. And, we were trying to do everything we could to get them back in their home. And so we tried to extend ourselves a little bit as much as we could, right, with understanding where we were with their deposit, and we would apply their deposit to their overdue invoices when we could, to kind of bridge the gap between when we had hoped the insurance would pay them more or for their next invoice, and sometimes that ended up working, and the insurance would pay out more to the client, but other times it didn't work, and we put ourselves in a precarious situation where, hey, we've kind of footed the bill here, and your insurance isn't giving you more money. What's the deal? What's the plan here, right? And so, unfortunately, we did get ourselves in that situation on a few projects, but it took longer than it should have for us to recognize that wasn't necessarily the responsible thing to do. So before we kind of took a step back, took a deep breath, and said, all right, we've got to come up with a policy here that eliminates this risk, and kind of get us out of this position that we found ourselves in with these insurance jobs, and that's how we had to move forward.
Yeah. So at what point did you realize that we needed to tighten that AR policy?
Well, we had it was pretty obvious that, when we had 2 or 3 projects that, and we had overdue client invoices that were 2, 3 draws old, and you've got hundreds of thousands of dollars that are just sitting there waiting to be collected, and there's no real sign that those are going to be coming to you anytime soon. So it was pretty apparent what needed to happen.
So what do we do now? Like what changed about the policy?
So we had to lay out some very explicit steps, right? So a timeline of what an overdue invoice looks like, right? So our project management team is very transparent once the invoice goes out, what the expectations are for that, right? And when we approach on an overdue invoice, hey, this is what happens when this becomes overdue, right? This is our first step, right? And if it becomes even further overdue, this is what happens, right? And just being very clear, and following through on that, so that we don't get ourselves back into that position. So and that ultimately is what became of our AR policy, which, once we had established that and started working that, we saw better AR collections and more of a response from clients willing to discuss, if they had an issue with their invoice, right? They're coming to the table and discussing those a lot sooner because we were acting on those overdue invoices. We were saying, hey, this is about to be overdue. This is what needs to happen, or else we're going to be in this sort of next phase of your overdue invoice, right? So that was sort of how that process developed and ultimately became an effective policy, something that we're obviously still using today, but really kind of honing in and still figuring out, tweaking it as we kind of move forward.
Yeah, I think it's important to say here that our goal throughout all of this was to keep the projects moving for our clients responsibly, but we had to do something that would keep our business stable, because if we don't, we can't just keep spending money to foot their projects, even though they were in a bad situation, because we can't deliver the experience that they deserve. We can't pay our payroll. We can't keep the lights on if we don't start getting invoices in. And we want to make sure that they have a good experience. So that's something that we take pretty seriously. It was an oversight. It was something we've never dealt with issues with payment ever since the beginning of this business, and never thought that we would, because we never had to. And then it's just in that moment, it became something extremely critical to our business that if we didn't fix, would break us. Yeah. So at the same time that all of this is happening, we're also trying to scale our team, right? Because we went from probably 15 people pre-storm to 26, 27, something like that, towards the end of the storm. Let's talk about that side of it a little bit.
Yeah, so I mentioned before, we'd already had discussions about what the next kind of year outlook looked like for scaling or growth and what our goals were. So we had those conversations. Nothing really concrete, but we had started looking into personnel, how those changes would affect our capacity and stuff like that. So once we started taking on all these restoration projects, I mentioned we had about 40 or so going on at one time. We had to look at what our capacity was, especially for our project supervisors and our project management team, what their capacity was and what was our best setup personnel-wise to take on these and be efficient with these, while also understanding that eventually our typical projects are going to start coming back into play. And we're going to start getting back to our normal remodels and additions and new home construction. So, prior to the storm, we had 2 project managers and 4 project supervisors, and we were about 20 to 30 projects. After the storm, that shifted, right? We added project supervisors in an attempt to kind of take on more of that volume. So I would say, and I'm not sure exactly how long it took before we restructured majorly.
I think it was pretty quick.
I think it was 2 months.
Yeah, I think it was pretty quickly after it all happened.
So yeah, I mean, we are, and I would say the biggest change that we went through was on the construction side. So we instituted a role for a director of construction that was overseeing the entire construction department, with the project manager and project supervisors directly reporting to him. And then, a couple independent roles with our crew leads, our internal crews, and then our warranty and closeout manager, and then a few other roles that we eventually added over time. So the construction department got quite the overhaul as far as structure goes, but it took some time, right? We had quite a bit of turnover. You know, the immediate growth that we had volume wise really kind of forced our hand as far as hiring goes, and so our hiring practices also had to develop in that time, right? We had to learn some valuable lessons in hiring and the folks we were trying to bring in that also worked with our core values and our company values. That you know, it was a good learning experience for the people that we were bringing in that ultimately didn't work out. And so that turnover, you know, each time we had turnover, it was a valuable lesson on, okay, well, you know, let's not do that again, or let's move in this direction. I think, you know, these things would work better, or these, you know, we need to be focused more on core values fits first, and then, you know, thinking about any particular role, right? So once we started doing that, and once we really kind of took a more focused approach to what our hiring practices were, we started seeing better results there, and ultimately found better people. So, but yeah, that was, I mean, all this going on during the chaotic time of these insurance jobs, and figuring out that whole landscape was fun.
Yeah. So a couple of things going on here. I mean, it seems like it would be easy enough just to add more people into the seats that already exist, but those seats that we had wouldn't really work for a larger, more scaled operation. So you can't just add 4 more supervisors and 2 more project managers. You actually had to change the way that those roles actually interact with each other. And you're an example of this as well, right? Because your position happened after the hurricane, and I think that we were able to adapt pretty quickly because we had a plan in place already for kind of like what our business development was going to look like, but we were kind of immediately thrown into it instead of given, you know, the space to be able to grow it over the course of a year or two, kind of like what we planned.
Yeah, it was certainly compressed, and so I was project managing prior to the storm, and mostly dealing on new construction, and trying to really develop the sales side of new construction as well. And so my role came to be pretty quickly, you know, once we had really kind of made some changes in the construction department. And one of the first things that we did was look at, okay, well, you know, is our setup here, our accountability chart, does it make sense for what we're trying to do, right? Does it make sense now, and does it make sense a year from now with what we're trying to do? And that took some time to really figure out, because it really, you know, was skewed a little bit with the people we were getting, right? You know, it wasn't until we found, or we thought we had the right people in place to really understand if that was the right setup of personnel. So it was a process that took some time, and, you know, looking back now, I'm like, well, yeah, of course this is the right setup, but it took a while to get here. And yeah, the onset of that with new, also, you know, we haven't talked about this yet, but training, right?
Yeah.
We've also got a lot of new roles that we haven't had in the company yet, or roles that have sort of shifted or taking on different responsibilities. And so all, you know, going on at the same time, we've got to figure out, okay, what are our training protocols for, you know, each individual position, but what's our SOP for training in general, any new hire. So looking at that critically, and then just kind of figuring out, okay, you know, this person's been here for 90 days, but what does their training plan look like, right? How can we set them up for success and not, you know, just kind of throw them in the fire? We need to find the best ways to support them as a new employee for this company, but also to be successful in the field or for whatever role they're in. So that was also another thing in the mix. There was trying to figure out the best way to implement some strong training protocols for new hires and for roles that had shifted, for folks that had already been here and maybe just kind of changed roles or added some responsibilities to their seat. So
yeah, I think it kind of it's kind of twofold, right? Because you've got you're kind of losing all the colloquial knowledge that you have from people that have been here for a long time because their positions are kind of changing. So some of the things that they used to do, they no longer do. And now you've got 50% more people as well. So you have them who know nothing about what's going on, and then you have people that have been here for a long time just trying to help keep things up in the air. And that's really hard. That's a really hard environment to be in, both from owning a business and from being an employee within that business. So
yeah, well, and two, one of the other things that was at play was the mindset of everyone, really, because everyone was coming from the right place. It was, the mindset was, hey, we need to get stuff done, right? That is at the forefront of our mind. We need to get stuff done. We need to get these people back in their homes, and not that that's always a sort of frantic approach, but it tends to, you miss a lot of things when you have that mindset or when you're rushing, and to try and step back and say, hey, yes, of course we want to get things done, but we also got to make sure we're doing it in the right way. And that's where we got separated a little bit was, we make all these changes, organizational changes, create all these new roles, and then now, once we've done that, people are in their seats and they're working their respective roles, and now we're trying to implement all of their SOPs, right, and make sure that they understand what their role is, and like you mentioned it, right, if we had a year to kind of roll this out and make sure that everybody was comfortable in their roles and their new positions, and was had clarity on what all they were responsible for, and train that appropriately, it would have gone a lot smoother. But we didn't really have that at our disposal. We were kind of thrust into this immediately, and it was out of necessity that we had to grow, and we had to create these positions, and we had to immediately start getting stuff done. So having to try and sort of retroactively train these folks in the field as they're doing things was a test for sure.
Oh yeah. I think the reason that I wanted to bring this topic in is because I think that the things that we're talking about here do relate a lot to another builder, another construction company that is in a high growth phase, right? They've lived in this space for a very long time, and then all of a sudden, say like they get a hold of a development, and now they've got 20 different houses that they're going to be building, and they have to scale quickly. This is a great example because it kind of follows the same lines. I mean, we had systems in place, right? We had HR systems, we had operations systems, we had finance and admin systems, we had estimating. All of those things were already in place, but as soon as we added this additional capacity to it, it all broke, right? I mean, every single one of those systems had to be tweaked in some way to accommodate this larger, more scaled organization.
Yeah.
So before all of this happened, we were pretty busy. We had a bunch of work. We were growing. Because of what you saw during the time of the hurricane, do you feel like we were in a strong position before the hurricane started?
At the time, yeah, I would have said we were. Absolutely. We didn't have any major. There wasn't chaos, right? We were comfortable with what we were doing. We were still getting leads in. We were still going through design. We were starting projects. We were closing projects out. We had what I would consider our normal capacity at the time. And so what we knew at the time, the processes that we knew at the time, right? We were working those processes, and nothing seemed really out of sorts. Obviously, you've always got issues on any particular project, but nothing out of sorts. Nothing glaring, I would say.
So I think for me, I've got the rose-colored glasses, as people say, but I probably would have given us maybe like a 8 or 9 out of 10 before the hurricane happened. I was pretty happy with it. I thought this is all going great. We've got great scalable systems, nothing to worry about, no big problems. But if there's anything that I've learned, it's the exact moment that you think that everything is great is when everything is about to break.
Yeah, and it did.
Yeah.
And yeah, looking back now, sitting where we are now with the structure that we have in place and everything that's changed, the new roles that we have, our processes have been sort of modified, tweaked, and our fit our, personnel, our organization better now. Looking back now, that would be more like a 4, a 5.
Oh, yeah.
Just a position of strength now versus then is wildly different. For sure.
Yeah, and I think that another thing that we kind of have to look at is like we were really, really busy during the hurricane, right? Extremely busy, and from the outside, and this is something that I talked about in another podcast, is we looked really busy, we looked really successful, but when it was happening, did it feel extremely stable?
It felt anything but.
Yeah.
Anything but. It was chaotic. It half the time, the left hand didn't know what the right was doing, and so it was just constant troubleshooting, problem solving, which is not out of the ordinary, but it was incredibly multiplied during that time. So yeah, it was not what I would consider to be streamlined at that point.
Sure. So has your perspective on growth changed? I mean, I know that before the hurricane happened, you weren't necessarily in this position, but now that you are, and you've kind of gone through a high growth phase as it is, has your perspective changed at all on what growth looks like at scale?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, being in the position that I was prior to the storm, I wasn't, that wasn't really at the forefront of my mind. I was very project oriented, day-to-day type things that I wasn't looking at a 10,000 foot view of the company. And so, now that I've had the chance to have that view and take a few steps back and have a different perspective, it's been a good learning process for me to really understand where we were falling short, or what our thoughts were on growth at that time versus what we ultimately ended up growing into was wildly different in my eyes. I don't know how you had pictured it prior to then versus now, but it wasn't this in my mind. It wasn't this in my mind, but and that's part of it too, because this makes so much sense now, but I wouldn't have had that thought prior to us actually doing this.
Yeah, I think you just have to, sometimes you just learn from being right in the middle of it.
Yeah.
So if you take everything that we talked about and say you're talking to another builder or even a homeowner, what would you want them to understand? What would you want them to take out of what we went through?
Well, I want to say this because one of the biggest things that happened during the storm, or one of the biggest things that we had to sort of ask of the clients was for patience. Right? There were so many things that were out of our control, out of their control, and as frustrating as that entire process was, we did have their best interest, right, at heart, and we wanted to get them back in their homes. We wanted them to not have to pay an exorbitant amount of money to get back in their homes. And so ultimately it came down to communication and transparency for us, right? We tried to be as transparent as we could with them about what was going on, what the expectations were, and really have that be a collaborative experience because, and we do this with our typical projects as well, right? We want this process to be a collaborative one, right? And one of our core values is team above all, and our clients are a part of that, right? We want them to be a part of our team, and we want a construction process that has a reputation of not being very enjoyable to be one that they enjoy, and they can look back on and say, hey, I remember back then when we did our renovation, it was such a neat experience, like, having the creative input that we had, and we got, this space that we now love through that process. And so, it really is part of our intent and our sales process and our construction process, our design process. It's our intent to bring them in as a member of our team and share that experience with them, so that it goes as smoothly as possible. So, I would just say to anyone, right, any one of our clients or anyone doing construction, like it truly is, or it should be a collaborative experience, right? One that they understand the expectations of the project. We understand what their expectations are, right? And that the communication is a two-way street, because that's when we see the most difficulty and the most issues come up is when somebody's confused or when somebody's expectations aren't being met. And, you say it all the time, but I couldn't agree more. I would much rather get feedback from a client that we're communicating with them too much and they would like for us to go away than, hey, I'm not getting any sort of information here and I'm getting frustrated. It causes so many issues when expectations aren't clear. And yeah.
I think if I had one thing to say to builders, or other folks that are put into a situation like we were put in, it's definitely having systems, right? The systems that we had maybe didn't work as well as we thought they would have, but they did something, right? I mean, I can't imagine having to go through that without any of those things in place. I mean, luckily for us, we did have those, estimating and sales pieces put together. We had admin and finance things put together. We had an operations and construction team that we were pretty confident in. But if you just try to jump into it and then try to hire all of those people right off rip, it's going to be an absolute nightmare, because training is just so hard to do when you're doing it with 5, 6, 7 people at a time. A lot more.
Well, I would say too, to just kind of expand on that, not only having systems, but knowing your systems, right? Some of the issues we kind of ran into during these, this phase was, we had a lot of new systems in place or systems that had been changed to kind of accommodate the capacity or the volume that we had going on at the time. And we didn't really know our systems that well, right? Our new systems, we hadn't really run them through 10, 20, 30 projects and really kind of refine them. We were doing that in like during all of this. So, when something would come up and a client would question a process or a system and we wouldn't have a confident answer on what that was, it killed their confidence, right? And so being able to convey confidence in your systems and really understand what they are and how they contribute to their project will go a long way to building that confidence, keeping that relationship with your customers, and something that can certainly cause issues if you or the people you have in the field communicating these things with your clients don't know the systems that well.
That's right. Well, thanks, Kevin. This has been great. Glad to talk with you about this. Hope to see you again on the podcast, maybe at another episode.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. So I think what this really shows is that construction businesses don't get defined when everything is going smoothly. They get defined in moments like this, when things are changing, when conditions aren't ideal, and when you're forced to make decisions without perfect information. And for us, this was one of those moments. It showed us where we were strong, but it also showed us a lot of places where we needed to improve. And it pushed us to build better systems, better structure, better discipline in how we operate, because at the end of the day, whether you're a builder listening to this or somebody thinking about hiring a builder, what really matters is how a company performs when things aren't perfect. That's where trust is built. That's where these systems matter. And that's what ultimately creates a better experience for everyone involved. So if you got value out of this, that's what Brickonomics Unplugged is going to be about. Real conversations about what it actually looks like to run a construction business and how those experiences shape how we operate going forward. Appreciate you being here, and we'll see you in the next one.